If you can picture this, a 1,700-year-old granite tower, taller than a 10-story building, carved from a single, solid block of stone. No seams, no joints, just one impossibly large piece of rock, standing upright in the African highlands. It weighs over 500 tons, and at some point in its history, it fell, or was pulled down. Nobody agrees on which. Now here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. In the 3rd century AD, a Persian prophet named Mani sat down and ranked the greatest powers on earth. Not 5, not 6, 4. And sitting right there next to Rome, Persia, and China was a kingdom most people alive today have never heard of. Its name was Aksum, and for almost 1,000 years, it controlled one of the most valuable trade corridors on the planet, minted its own gold currency when almost nobody else did, and left behind monuments so advanced that modern engineers still argue about how they were built. So why did one of the 4 greatest empires in the ancient world just vanish from popular memory? Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how Aksum got rich, why kings across 3 continents feared and courted it, what's really going on with those stone giants, and why its disappearance is one of the strangest unsolved stories in ancient history. And near the end, I'm going to show you the one clue hiding in plain sight in the ruins of Aksum that some researchers think could rewrite everything we know about where its wealth actually went. So don't go anywhere. Let's get into it. Let's start with a simple question. Where even is Aksum? If you drew a line from the southern tip of Egypt down along the Red Sea, then cut inland into the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, you'd land right in the heart of it. This region sits at one of the most strategically valuable crossroads on Earth, close enough to the Red Sea to control maritime trade, but elevated enough in the highlands to be defensible, fertile, and resource-rich. Aksum emerged as a unified, organized kingdom somewhere around the 1st century AD, although its roots stretch back further into earlier Ethiopian civilizations like Dumt. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it wasn't just a regional kingdom. It was an empire, with its own script, its own currency, its own navy, and eventually its own religion that would shape the entire region for the next 1,700 years. And here's your first curiosity loop. Aksum is one of the only civilizations in ancient history to independently develop its own system of writing, its own coinage, and its own calendar, a trio that only a handful of the most powerful cultures in human history can claim. We're going to come back to that coinage in a bit, because what's stamped on those coins tells us something almost nobody expects. But to understand why Aksum mattered, why it got a seat at the table with Rome, Persia, and China, you have to understand geography. Because Aksum's entire rise to power is a masterclass in one idea: control the choke point, and you control the wealth. Here's a fact that surprises most people. In the ancient world, more wealth often passed through narrow maritime corridors than through entire countries. And one of the most important corridors on the planet was the Red Sea. Why? Because the Red Sea was the fastest route connecting the Mediterranean world to India, the Arabian Peninsula, and, through intermediaries, China. Rome wanted silk, spices, ivory, and gemstones from the east. India and Arabia wanted gold, wine, and manufactured Roman goods. And sitting right at the mouth of the Red Sea, controlling the ports that ships had to pass through, was the kingdom of Aksum. Its main port, Adulis, on the coast of the Red Sea, became one of the busiest and most cosmopolitan harbors in the ancient world. Merchants from Rome, Egypt, Persia, Arabia, and India all passed through it. Ships loaded with Axumite ivory, gold, tortoiseshell, rhinoceros horn, obsidian, and, increasingly, enslaved people left these ports bound for the Mediterranean and beyond. In return, Aksum imported wine, olive oil, glassware, and fine cloth from Rome, and iron tools, weapons, and textiles from India and Arabia. This wasn't some backwater kingdom trading scraps. Aksum sat at the literal intersection of 3 continents' worth of commerce: Africa, Arabia, and by extension, the Mediterranean and South Asian trading worlds. Its merchants and rulers grew unbelievably wealthy simply by taxing, facilitating, and participating in the flow of goods passing beneath their control. And here's where it gets interesting, because Aksum didn't just profit passively. It became a military and naval power, specifically to protect and expand this advantage. Axumite fleets crossed the Red Sea and intervened directly in the affairs of South Arabia, modern-day Yemen, conquering and administering territory on the opposite coastline at various points in its history. Think about that for a second. An African kingdom based in the highlands of Ethiopia was powerful enough to project military force across open water and control territory in Arabia. That's not a regional kingdom. That's an empire with reach. Now here's a curiosity loop worth holding on to. There's a document from this era, a merchant's guide called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that describes Aksum's coastline in vivid detail. And buried in that text is a description of something so unexpected for this period that historians still debate exactly what it means. We'll get to that mystery a little later, because it connects directly to a rumor about where Aksum's gold was really coming from. Let's talk about those coins, because this is one of the most underrated facts about Aksum, and it's the kind of detail that historians get genuinely excited about. In the ancient world, only a small handful of states minted their own coinage in gold, silver, and bronze consistently at scale, with royal portraits and inscriptions. Rome did it, Persia did it, and Aksum did it too, starting around the reign of King Endubis in the late 3rd century AD. This matters enormously because coinage isn't just money. It's propaganda, it's infrastructure, and it's a signal of serious, centralized state power. A kingdom mints its own coins when it has the metallurgical capacity, the administrative sophistication, and the trade volume to justify it, and when it wants the rest of the world to recognize its legitimacy. Axumite coins have been found not just within its own borders, but across the Mediterranean, in India, and along the Arabian coastline, physical proof of just how far Axumite trade networks stretched. And the inscriptions on these coins evolved over time in a way that tells its own story. Early coins bore inscriptions in Greek, the international trade language of the era, signaling that Aksum wanted to be legible and legitimate to Mediterranean traders. Later coins shifted to include Ge'ez, the native Axumite script, and eventually began carrying explicitly Christian symbols, the cross. That shift is a big deal, and we'll unpack it fully in the religion section coming up, because Aksum's conversion to Christianity wasn't just a spiritual event, it was a geopolitical earthquake that reshaped alliances across the ancient world. But first, let's talk about the thing everyone actually came here for, the obelisks. If you travel to the town of Aksum today, in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, you'll find a field of towering carved stone monuments called stelae, giant single-block granite structures, some standing, some collapsed, some in fragments. And once you understand what these things actually are, they become genuinely hard to wrap your head around. The largest of them all, known as the Great Stele, is estimated to have stood over 33 meters tall, roughly the height of a 10-story building, and to have weighed somewhere in the range of 500 to 600 tons. To put that in perspective, that's heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 747. And it wasn't assembled from multiple blocks stacked together. It was carved from a single, continuous piece of granite. Here's your next curiosity loop, and it's a big one. Nobody has ever fully explained how the Axumites quarried, transported, and raised a stone of that size using the technology available to them at the time. We're going to walk through the leading theories in a moment, including one that some researchers find genuinely unsettling. But hold that thought, because first, you need to understand what these things were actually for. These stelae weren't just decorative. They were funerary monuments, most likely erected to mark the burial sites of Axumite kings and elites, some of them concealed above elaborate underground burial chambers. The carvings on the surface of the stelae are deliberately designed to mimic multi-story buildings, false doors, false windows, and beam ends carved into the stone, as though each obelisk represents a towering palace tower, frozen in stone, standing guard over the dead for eternity. Some of them are still standing after nearly 2,000 years. Others weren't so lucky. The great stele itself apparently collapsed and shattered, possibly during construction, possibly from the sheer, punishing weight of its own design, exceeding the engineering limits of the era. When it fell hard, breaking into massive fragments that still lie scattered on the ground at Aksum today, a monument to ambition that outpaced its own execution. And then there's the stele that didn't stay home. In 1937, Italian fascist forces occupying Ethiopia dismantled one of the smaller, though still enormous, stelae, cut it into pieces, shipped it to Rome, and re-erected it as a trophy near the Circus Maximus. For nearly 70 years, a piece of one of Africa's greatest ancient civilizations stood as a monument in a European capital, a literal, physical symbol of colonial plunder. It wasn't returned to Ethiopia until 2005 and wasn't fully re-erected at its original site until 2008. That obelisk's journey, stolen, displayed abroad for generations, then finally returned, is honestly a story that deserves its own deep dive, and it's part of what I'm teasing for the second video, so keep that in the back of your mind. Now, back to the mystery. How did they actually build these things? There are a few competing theories about how the Axumites managed to quarry, move, and erect stones of this size, and none of them are fully satisfying on their own, which is exactly why this remains a live debate among archaeologists. Theory 1. Massive manual labor and ramps. The most widely accepted explanation is that the Axumites used a combination of earthen ramps, log rollers, and enormous coordinated labor forces, potentially thousands of workers, to drag the quarried stones from the source site to their final position, then use a system of ramps and levers to tilt them upright. This is broadly similar to theories used to explain Egyptian pyramid construction, and it doesn't require any technology beyond what we know Aksum possessed: rope, timber, earthworks, and organized manpower. Theory 2. Elephants. Yes, some researchers have proposed that domesticated or semi-domesticated elephants may have been used to help haul the stones, given elephants were present in the region and used elsewhere in the ancient world for heavy labor. It's a compelling idea, but there's limited direct archaeological evidence to confirm it specifically at Aksum. Theory 3, and this is the one that tends to grab people's attention. Some fringe theories claim the precision of the carvings and the sheer scale of the stones suggest lost or advanced engineering knowledge that mainstream archaeology can't fully explain. Now, to be clear, the overwhelming consensus among actual archaeologists is that human ingenuity, coordinated labor, and centuries of accumulated skill are entirely sufficient to explain the stelae, without needing anything mysterious or unexplained. But the fact that this theory even circulates tells you something about just how genuinely impressive and how genuinely underdocumented this achievement is in the public imagination. When ancient people build something this astonishing and modern audiences have barely heard of it, mystery fills the vacuum. The real mystery, in other words, isn't how did ancient humans do this without help. It's why don't more people know that ancient Africans did this at all? And that question is going to come up again and again throughout this video because it's really the central theme of Aksum's whole story. An empire of extraordinary wealth, power, and engineering ambition that quietly slipped out of the world's collective memory. Coming up, I want to show you exactly how powerful Aksum's kings actually were, including one king whose military campaigns stretched from the Nile Valley to the Arabian Peninsula, and whose religious conversion changed the fate of an entire region. But first, let's talk about something almost nobody mentions when they talk about Aksum, the legend that ties it directly to one of the most famous religious relics in the entire world. Here's a curiosity loop that's been alive for over 1,000 years. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark of the Covenant, the same golden chest said to contain the 10 Commandments in the Hebrew Bible, is not lost to history at all. It's sitting in a heavily guarded chapel in Aksum right now, protected by a single monk chosen for life to be its sole guardian, who is never permitted to leave the chapel grounds once he takes on the role. The story goes like this. The Ethiopian national epic, the Kebra Nagast, tells of a romance between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon of Israel, and claims their son, Menelik I, later traveled to Jerusalem and on his return journey to Ethiopia brought the Ark of the Covenant back with him, where it has remained protected in Aksum ever since. Now, historically speaking, there's no verifiable archaeological or documentary evidence confirming the Ark is actually there, and most historians treat this as a foundational national and religious legend rather than a literal historical record. But here's why it matters, regardless of whether it's literally true. This legend is central to Ethiopian Orthodox Christian identity, and it directly ties Aksum, a kingdom in the African highlands, to the very origins of the Abrahamic religious tradition. It positioned Aksum in its own self-understanding, not as a peripheral kingdom on the edge of the ancient world, but as a direct spiritual heir to Solomon and Sheba, a kingdom with divine legitimacy stretching back to the beginning of biblical history. And that self-image mattered because it fed directly into one of the most consequential decisions any Axumite king ever made. If there's one individual ruler you need to know from Axumite history, it's King Ezana, who reigned in the 4th century AD. Ezana was, by any measure, one of the most powerful monarchs of his era. He led military campaigns that reached deep into the Nile Valley, ultimately defeating and effectively ending the long-declining kingdom of Kush, the ancient rival power centered at Meroe that had itself once rivaled Egypt. Ezana's inscriptions, carved in multiple languages including Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaean, boast of military campaigns stretching across the Red Sea into Arabia as well. This was a king whose reach extended from the African interior to the Arabian Peninsula, a truly continental sphere of influence. But Ezana's most consequential act wasn't military. It was religious. Sometime in the 4th century, King Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the very first states in the entire world, alongside Armenia, to adopt Christianity as an official state religion, doing so decades before the Roman Empire itself would fully embrace it under later emperors. This is a detail that surprises almost everyone who hears it. An African kingdom converting to Christianity at essentially the same moment, or even earlier, than the Roman Empire, and centuries before Christianity spread into most of Northern Europe. This conversion reshaped everything. Axumite coins, as we mentioned earlier, began carrying the Christian cross. Aksum aligned itself religiously and diplomatically with the Byzantine Christian world, while distinguishing itself from the Zoroastrian Persian Empire and, later, from the rising tide of Arabian polytheism and eventually Islam. It positioned Aksum as a Christian power with a direct line, at least in its own telling, back to Solomon himself. And here's a curiosity loop worth sitting with. Ethiopia's Christian tradition, born out of this exact moment in Axumite history, never broke. It has survived continuously for over 1,600 years, making Ethiopian Christianity one of the oldest continuously practiced Christian traditions on the planet, older than most of the Christian traditions found across Western Europe. That direct, unbroken line traces back to this single king, in this single forgotten empire, making a decision that would echo for over a millennium and a half. We're going to come back to what happened to this Christian kingdom when the religious map of the region shifted dramatically a few centuries later, because that shift is deeply tied to Aksum's eventual decline. But first, let's answer the biggest question of this whole video directly. Let's go back to that quote I opened this video with, because it's time to actually unpack it properly. In the 3rd century AD, the Persian prophet Mani, founder of Manichaeism, a religious movement that briefly spread across huge swaths of the ancient world, wrote a passage identifying what he considered the 4 great kingdoms of the world. The list included the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, specifically the Sasanian Empire of his era, the Kingdom of the Chinese, and, remarkably, the Kingdom of the Axumites. Take a moment to actually sit with how extraordinary that is. This isn't a modern historian retroactively praising an underrated civilization for clout. This is a contemporary, 3rd century observer, someone with genuine geopolitical awareness of the ancient world's major players, placing Aksum in the same tier as Rome, Persia, and China. Why would he do that? Because from a 3rd century vantage point, that ranking made complete sense. Rome controlled the Mediterranean and Western Europe. Persia controlled the heart of the Middle East and Central Asian trade routes. China controlled the eastern end of the Silk Road and enormous internal wealth. And Aksum controlled the maritime choke point, connecting all of them to East Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean trade world, while also fielding organized armies, minting recognized currency, and administering territory across 2 continents. In other words, Aksum wasn't a curiosity or a footnote. To a sophisticated 3rd century observer surveying the entire known world, it was legitimately one of the 4 most powerful states on Earth. So here's the real question this video has been building toward. If that's true, if Aksum really was ranked alongside Rome, Persia, and China by the people who actually lived through that era, why does almost nobody today put Aksum in that same conversation? Part of the answer is really uncomfortable, and it's worth naming directly. A huge amount of how history gets remembered and taught depends on which civilizations continued producing large, centralized, literate successor states that controlled the narrative, and which regions became targets of later colonization, where indigenous historical narratives were actively suppressed, dismissed, or simply ignored by colonial-era scholars. Rome's legacy was absorbed into the story Europe tells about itself. China's continuous imperial tradition kept its own history center stage. Persia's legacy fed directly into the Islamic world's historical self-understanding. But Aksum's direct successor, states in the Ethiopian highlands, despite maintaining an unbroken Christian and monarchical tradition for well over 1,000 years, existed largely outside the historical frameworks that dominated European and Middle Eastern academic traditions for centuries, and were, frankly, often deliberately excluded or minimized by colonial-era historians who had strong incentives not to highlight sophisticated, powerful African civilizations. That's not a side note. That's basically the whole reason you're watching this video right now, instead of already knowing this from a school textbook. So what actually happened to Aksum? How does a kingdom powerful enough to be ranked with Rome, Persia, and China simply fade away? The honest answer is that historians don't have one single, clean explanation. They have several overlapping factors, and the debate over which mattered most is still very much alive. Factor 1. The rise of Islam and the shifting trade map. Starting in the 7th century, the rapid rise and expansion of Islam fundamentally reorganized trade routes across Arabia, the Red Sea, and the broader Middle East. Aksum, as a Christian kingdom, found itself increasingly cut off from directly controlling or profiting from trade routes that were now dominated by new Islamic states and merchant networks. Interestingly, early Islamic tradition actually records a moment of goodwill between the two worlds. According to Islamic tradition, the Axumite king offered protection to early followers of Muhammad who fled persecution in Mecca, an episode Muslims refer to as the first hijrah. But goodwill in religious memory didn't stop the broader economic reality. Aksum's role as the indispensable middleman of Red Sea trade was structurally undermined as new powers took over the routes it once dominated. Factor 2. Environmental pressures. Some archaeological and paleoclimate evidence suggests the highlands around Aksum may have experienced soil exhaustion, deforestation, and climatic shifts that reduced agricultural output over time, straining the kingdom's ability to feed and sustain its population and its capital city at the scale it once had. Factor 3. Internal political fragmentation. As with most long-lived empires, Aksum's political cohesion appears to have weakened over the centuries following its peak, with power gradually shifting away from the city of Aksum itself toward other regional centers within the Ethiopian highlands. Factor 4. And this is the one many people find most fascinating. Aksum didn't actually disappear. This is critical to understand. The kingdom's power, wealth, and international trade dominance faded, and its great capital city was eventually abandoned as the political center of gravity. But its people, culture, language, and, crucially, its Christian religious tradition never vanished. Instead, they evolved directly into successor Ethiopian kingdoms and dynasties that continued for centuries afterward, all the way through to the Ethiopian monarchy that persisted, remarkably, into the 20th century. So Aksum's story isn't really a story of total collapse, like the fall of Rome. It's a story of gradual transformation, a superpower that quietly stepped back from the center of the global stage, while its cultural and religious DNA continued on, largely unnoticed by the rest of the world, for another millennium and a half. And that's genuinely one of the most remarkable things about this entire story. The forgotten superpower didn't actually vanish, we just stopped paying attention. Here's something that might genuinely surprise you. For centuries, the wider world essentially forgot Aksum existed as anything more than a vague legend. While the Ethiopian highlands themselves never forgot, local communities, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and successor dynasties maintained continuous knowledge of Aksum's importance. European and Middle Eastern scholarship largely lost track of the empire that Mani had once ranked alongside Rome, Persia, and China. It wasn't until European travelers and later professional archaeologists began systematically documenting the ruins at Aksum, starting in earnest in the 19th and 20th centuries, that the wider academic world began to reckon with just how sophisticated and powerful this civilization had actually been. Major archaeological expeditions throughout the 20th century gradually pieced together the chronology of Axumite kings, mapped the stele field, excavated palace complexes, and uncovered inscriptions that confirmed details previously known only through legend and fragmentary outside references from Greek and Roman sources. And here's a curiosity loop worth sitting with. Archaeologists are still actively excavating in and around Aksum today, and significant discoveries continue to happen in the modern era, meaning our understanding of this empire is genuinely still being written in real time as you're watching this. This isn't a settled ancient history story like Rome, where every major site has been picked over for centuries. Aksum is, in a very real sense, still being rediscovered. There are almost certainly tombs, artifacts, and inscriptions still buried beneath that landscape that could change details of this story in the coming years. One of the most important rediscoveries involves the underground tomb complexes connected to the stele field. And this is where things get genuinely eerie. Remember those giant stelae we talked about earlier? The massive single-block granite towers marking royal burial sites? Well, it turns out the visible stone towers are really just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath many of them lie elaborate underground tomb complexes, multi-chambered structures cut into bedrock, built with precisely fitted stone, sometimes featuring drainage systems, sealed doorways, and architectural details suggesting the builders anticipated these spaces would need to endure for a very long time. One of the most significant is known as the Tomb of the Brick Arches, notable for using fired brick, a material and construction technique that was relatively unusual for the region and era, hinting at outside architectural influence, likely absorbed through Aksum's extensive trade contacts with the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world. Another major complex, referred to by archaeologists as the Mausoleum, sits directly beneath the area where the Great Stele once stood before its catastrophic collapse, and features a sophisticated system of interlocking granite blocks and passageways. Here's the part that keeps this mystery alive. Many of these tombs were found looted in antiquity, meaning at some point after their construction, likely within a few centuries, someone with detailed knowledge of these tombs' locations and internal layouts broke in and removed whatever treasures had been buried alongside Aksum's kings. Given the wealth we know Aksum possessed, gold coinage, imported luxury goods, ivory, and precious materials from across the Indian Ocean trade world, historians believe these royal tombs would have originally contained genuinely staggering hoards of treasure, which raises an unsettling question. Where did it all go? This is actually connected to that clue I teased at the very beginning of this video, the one hiding in plain sight at Aksum that some researchers think could reveal where a significant portion of the empire's wealth actually ended up. I'm not going to leave you hanging on this one much longer, so hold tight because we're circling back to it very soon. But first, let's put some real numbers behind just how wealthy and connected Aksum actually was, because the scale of its Indian Ocean trade network is honestly staggering once you see it laid out. Let's zoom in on Adulis, Aksum's primary port on the Red Sea coast, because this city deserves way more recognition than it gets. Adulis functioned as the commercial heart of the entire empire, the physical point where African, Arabian, Mediterranean, and South Asian trade networks all converged. Archaeological excavations at the site have uncovered building foundations, church remains, extensive pottery from multiple foreign trade zones, and evidence of a genuinely cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic urban population living and trading together. The range of goods that moved through Adulis reads like an inventory of the ancient world's most valuable commodities. Outbound from Aksum, ivory, considered some of the finest available anywhere in the ancient world, and hugely prized in both Rome and India for carving and decorative arts, along with gold, emeralds, tortoiseshell prized for luxury goods, rhinoceros horn, obsidian used in tool and weapon manufacturing, and, more troublingly, enslaved people, a grim but historically undeniable component of ancient trade economies across this entire region. Inbound to Aksum, Roman and Mediterranean glassware, fine cloth, wine, olive oil, and manufactured metal goods, alongside Indian and Arabian textiles, iron, and spices. Here's a curiosity loop worth holding on to. Some of the glass and pottery fragments found at Adulis have been traced back to specific manufacturing regions in the Roman Mediterranean and South Asia, meaning archaeologists can literally map out, object by object, exactly how far Aksum's trade tentacles reached. And the map that emerges is bigger than most people would ever guess for an African kingdom of this era. And this is where that document I mentioned earlier comes back into play, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a merchant's navigational and trade guide written by an anonymous Greek-speaking author, most likely a merchant himself, probably in the 1st century AD. This document describes ports, trade goods, and political relationships all along the Red Sea, East African coast, Arabia, and India, and it treats the Axumite region and its trade network as a serious, established, economically significant player in this entire system, worthy of detailed commercial description right alongside major Mediterranean and Arabian ports. That's not a passing mention. That's a contemporary merchant treating Aksum as a serious economic power worth understanding in commercial detail. Further confirmation from an entirely independent source that Mani's later ranking of Aksum among the 4 great powers of the world wasn't some isolated, exaggerated claim. It reflected a genuinely accurate picture of how the ancient world's most sophisticated traders and observers actually viewed this kingdom. Let's actually put Aksum side by side with the other 3 powers Mani named, because seeing this comparison laid out makes the ranking feel a lot less surprising and a lot more earned. Rome, at its height, controlled a territory stretching from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East, with a population estimated in the tens of millions, an extraordinarily sophisticated legal and administrative system, and a currency system used across the entire Mediterranean basin. Persia, specifically the Sasanian Empire during Mani's lifetime, controlled a vast territory across the Iranian Plateau, Mesopotamia, and into Central Asia, commanding enormous agricultural wealth, a highly organized bureaucracy, and dominance over crucial overland trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Central and East Asia. China, under dynasties like the Han and later successors, controlled a massive, densely populated territory, an advanced bureaucratic and administrative tradition stretching back centuries, and enormous internal economic output, alongside control over the eastern terminus of Silk Road trade. Aksum, by comparison, controlled a smaller total territory and population than any of these 3 giants. But, and this is the key point, territory and population size aren't the only measures of ancient power. Aksum controlled something arguably just as valuable, an irreplaceable geographic choke point. Just as a country controlling a narrow strait or canal today can wield outsized global influence regardless of its total size, Aksum's position, controlling access between the Mediterranean world, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean, gave it economic and strategic leverage far beyond what its raw size would suggest. Aksum also matched the other 3 powers in several other crucial, harder-to-fake indicators of serious statehood. Independent gold currency, a standing military capable of cross-continental projection, a functioning bureaucracy sophisticated enough to leave behind multilingual royal inscriptions, monumental architecture on a scale requiring serious engineering and logistical coordination, and eventually official state religion adopted with the same speed and confidence as any Mediterranean power of the era. In other words, Aksum earned its spot on that list, not because it was as large as Rome or as populous as China, but because it hit every major benchmark of a serious, organized, wealthy, militarily capable ancient superpower, while doing it from a highland kingdom in East Africa that most people today couldn't find on a map. Let's play a quick thought experiment, because this is exactly the kind of question that makes ancient history genuinely fun to think about. What if the rise of Islam in the 7th century hadn't reorganized Red Sea and Arabian trade routes the way it did? What if Aksum had managed to maintain its dominant middleman position over Indian Ocean and Red Sea trade for another few centuries? Some historians speculate that a continued dominant Aksum could have evolved into something resembling a long-term East African maritime trading empire, similar in function to how later Indian Ocean trading states like the Swahili coast city-states or, further afield, Srivijaya in Southeast Asia operated, controlling wealth not through territorial conquest, but through indispensable control of maritime commerce. In that alternate timeline, Ethiopian Christian civilization, rather than becoming increasingly isolated from Mediterranean Christendom over the following centuries, might have remained a continuously central player in the story of the medieval world, rather than becoming, as it unfortunately did in the European imagination, an increasingly mysterious, semi-legendary kingdom on the edge of the known map. That mysterious reputation, by the way, is directly responsible for one of the strangest legends in medieval European history, the legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian king believed by medieval Europeans to rule a fabulously wealthy, powerful kingdom somewhere beyond the Islamic world. A legend that, over centuries, European explorers increasingly associated specifically with Ethiopia and its rulers. Entire expeditions were launched, driven partly by the hope of finding this legendary lost Christian ally. That's an entire story in itself, and it's one of the threads I want to pull on properly in the second video, because it shows you exactly how Aksum's successor kingdom went from being one of the 4 greatest powers on earth to becoming a half-mythical rumor whispered about in European royal courts 1,000 years later. All right, time to circle back to that thread I've been pulling on since the opening of this video. The clue at Aksum, that some researchers believe points to where a significant portion of the empire's legendary wealth actually went. Remember those looted royal tombs beneath the stele field? Here's the detail that makes this genuinely fascinating. The level of precision involved in those ancient lootings, the fact that looters seem to have known exactly where to dig, exactly which sealed chambers held the richest deposits, and managed this apparently without leaving behind the kind of chaotic, destructive damage you'd expect from random opportunistic grave robbers, has led some archaeologists to propose that these tombs weren't looted by outsiders at all. Instead, the theory goes, later Axumite rulers themselves, during periods of political and economic strain, may have deliberately reopened the tombs of their own ancestors to recover gold and treasure for reuse, essentially recycling the empire's own buried wealth back into circulation during harder times. If that's true, it reframes the entire mystery. The gold wasn't stolen by some unknown thief who got away with it. It was systematically reabsorbed back into the Axumite economy by its own later kings, potentially explaining both the precision of the looting and the gradual, rather than sudden, way Aksum's visible wealth and coinage seemed to decline in the archaeological record over the centuries following its peak. It's not a certainty, it's a leading theory among several, and it's exactly the kind of unresolved archaeological puzzle that makes Aksum such a genuinely rich subject for deeper investigation. And it's also a perfect example of why I keep telling you, this is not a closed case. This is a still unfolding archaeological mystery, and new excavations at Aksum could confirm, complicate, or completely overturn this theory in the coming years. Before we wrap up, I want to step back and make one final point, because I think it's the whole reason this video is worth your time. Aksum isn't some obscure footnote that only specialists should care about. It's direct, physical, undeniable proof that African civilizations built empires that stood shoulder to shoulder with Rome, Persia, and China, not as a diplomatic courtesy, not as a modern feel-good reframing, but according to the actual contemporary judgment of a 3rd century observer who had genuine, comparative geopolitical knowledge of the entire ancient world. The obelisks still standing in the Ethiopian highlands today are physical, undeniable monuments to that reality, carved from single blocks of granite, standing taller than most buildings on Earth at the time they were built, representing engineering ambition that required serious organizational, logistical, and technical sophistication to pull off. The gold coins stamped with royal portraits and later, Christian crosses are physical proof of a functioning, internationally recognized state economy. The unbroken thread of Ethiopian Christianity, running continuously for over 1,600 years back to King Ezana's conversion, is living proof that Aksum's legacy never actually disappeared. It just stopped being part of the story most of the world tells about the ancient past. The forgetting of Aksum isn't really a mystery about the ancient world at all. It's a mystery about us, about which histories get preserved, retold, and taught, and which ones quietly fall out of the frame, not because they weren't important, but because of who was left, generations later, doing the telling. And that's exactly why stories like this one matter, because the moment you know Aksum existed, the moment you've seen that field of towering granite stelae, learned about King Ezana's continental military campaigns, understood how a highland African kingdom controlled one of the most valuable trade corridors on the planet, you can't unknow it. It becomes part of how you understand the ancient world going forward, one more piece of a much bigger, much more genuinely global picture of the past than most of us ever got taught. We've talked a lot about kings, coins, and colossal stone monuments, but what did it actually feel like to live in Aksum at the height of its power? Archaeological excavations of the city of Aksum itself have uncovered the foundations of large, multi-story elite residences, built with a distinctive local architectural style featuring recessed walls, timber reinforcement set into stone construction, a technique historians call monkey head construction, because the protruding wooden beam ends resemble little carved heads poking out of the walls, and elaborate stone staircases connecting multiple floors. These weren't simple huts. Some of these elite residences appear to have been genuinely palatial, multi-story compounds with dozens of rooms, central courtyards, and separate structures for storage, staff, and possibly religious functions. Ordinary residents of Aksum and its surrounding towns lived in smaller stone and mud brick homes, working as farmers, herders, artisans, and traders. The economy wasn't just about long-distance luxury trade. It rested on a very active agricultural base in the surrounding highlands, where Axumite farmers cultivated a range of crops, including a grain called teff, which remains a staple of Ethiopian cuisine to this very day, along with barley, wheat, and various legumes, supported by a system of terraced farming adapted to the highland terrain. Here's a curiosity loop worth noting. Some archaeologists believe evidence of ancient agricultural terracing and water management systems around Aksum suggest a level of agricultural sophistication that allowed the region to support a genuinely large urban population, a population large enough to require serious food security planning, and large enough to explain how Aksum could field the substantial armies described in Ezana's own inscriptions. Feeding an empire, it turns out, is just as impressive an engineering challenge as building a 500-ton obelisk, just far less visually dramatic, which is probably part of why it gets so much less attention. Markets within Aksum would have been genuinely vibrant, multilingual spaces. Given the city's role as the political capital of an empire deeply tied into Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade, it's likely that merchants, travelers, and officials speaking Greek, Ge'ez, Sabaean, and various Arabian and Indian Ocean trade languages would have mixed together in its streets and markets, making Aksum, at its height, one of the more genuinely cosmopolitan cities anywhere in the ancient world. Let's circle back to something we mentioned early on, Aksum's writing system, Ge'ez. Ge'ez is one of the truly remarkable, underappreciated success stories in this entire narrative, because unlike the empire that created it, the script never actually disappeared. Ge'ez developed as Aksum's native writing system, evolving out of earlier South Arabian-influenced scripts used in the region before Aksum's rise, and by the time of King Ezana's reign, it had developed into a distinctive syllabic writing system, meaning each character represents a consonant-vowel combination rather than a single sound, a system that's structurally different from the alphabets used in the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world at the time. Here's the part that should genuinely impress you. Ge'ez script is still in active use today. It forms the direct basis for the modern Amharic and Tigrinya scripts used across Ethiopia and Eritrea today. And Ge'ez itself remains the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox and Eritrean Orthodox churches, used in religious services in a direct, unbroken tradition stretching back to the Axumite kings, who first commissioned inscriptions in it over 1,700 years ago. Think about what that actually means. The Latin alphabet went through the fall of Rome and came out the other side, transformed into dozens of different national scripts. Ge'ez, by contrast, has remained recognizably continuous, in continuous religious and eventually broader literary use, for one of the longest unbroken stretches of any writing system still actively used anywhere on the planet today. That's not a footnote. That's one of the most remarkable, quietly persistent cultural through lines in all of world history, and it traces directly back to the same kingdom that built those stone giants we've spent so much of this video on. We've mentioned Aksum's military campaigns a few times throughout this video, the conquest of Kush, the interventions across the Red Sea into Arabia, but it's worth pausing to really appreciate what kind of military infrastructure this actually required. Ezana's own inscriptions, carved in multiple languages so that both regional and international audiences could read of his achievements, describe campaigns involving thousands of troops, captured livestock numbering in the tens of thousands, and conquered populations numbering in the tens of thousands as well. These aren't the boastful exaggerations of a minor chieftain. These are the kinds of numbers that require serious logistical capacity, the ability to feed, arm, and coordinate large bodies of troops across considerable distances, including naval logistics capable of transporting and supplying forces across the Red Sea into Arabia. This tells us something important that's easy to overlook when you're staring at giant stone monuments. Aksum's real power wasn't just its ability to build impressive things. It was the underlying state capacity, the administrative, logistical, and organizational sophistication required to project military force across 2 continents, mint standardized currency recognized from the Mediterranean to India, and coordinate the labor needed to quarry, transport, and erect 500-ton granite monuments. Every one of those achievements depends on the same underlying ingredient, a genuinely sophisticated, centralized state apparatus. That's the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting underneath every spectacular fact in this video. The obelisks are impressive. The coins are impressive. The military campaigns are impressive. But what's actually most impressive is the invisible administrative machine that made all 3 possible simultaneously for centuries in a highland kingdom most people today have never even heard of. While the historical record on Axumite royal women is admittedly thinner than we'd like, there are important threads worth pulling on here. The Queen of Sheba legend, tied to Aksum through the Kebra Nagas tradition we discussed earlier, positioned female royal authority at the very foundational myth of Ethiopian statehood. A queen, not a king, sits at the origin point of the entire dynastic tradition Axumite and later Ethiopian rulers claim descent from. Beyond the legendary material, archaeological evidence from elite burial sites suggests aristocratic women in Axumite society had access to considerable personal wealth. Grave goods, including imported jewelry, glassware, and fine textiles, have been recovered from elite female burials, suggesting women within Aksum's ruling class participated meaningfully in the same international luxury trade networks that defined elite male status in the empire. This is a thread that deserves far more dedicated research than it's historically received, and it's exactly the kind of gap that ongoing excavation at Aksum could help fill in the coming years. One more example of how this forgotten superpower is still, quite literally, in the process of being rediscovered. Beyond the stele, Aksum developed a genuinely distinctive architectural and artistic style that blended influences from South Arabia, the Mediterranean world, and indigenous highland traditions into something recognizably its own. That monkey head, timber and stone construction technique we mentioned earlier wasn't just used in elite residences. It became a defining feature of Axumite monumental architecture more broadly, including the churches that began appearing across the empire following Ezana's conversion to Christianity. Some of these architectural principles directly influenced later extraordinary Ethiopian religious architecture, including, centuries later, the astonishing rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved directly downward out of solid volcanic rock rather than built upward. While Lalibela postdates Aksum by many centuries, historians see a direct cultural and religious through-line connecting Aksumite Christian architectural tradition to these later masterpieces, meaning Aksum's influence on Ethiopian architecture didn't stop when its political power faded. It kept shaping the region's built environment for another 1,000 years. That connection between Aksum's monumental stone tradition and Ethiopia's later rock-hewn church tradition is honestly a whole video topic in itself, and it's a thread I'd genuinely love to pull on in future content if there's interest, because the visual and engineering through-line between these two eras of Ethiopian monument building is stunning once you see them side by side. Let's zoom all the way back out, because we've covered a huge amount of ground in this video, and it's worth pulling all these threads together one final time before we close things out. Aksum controlled one of the ancient world's most valuable trade chokepoints, connecting Rome, Persia, Arabia, India, and East Africa into a single interconnected commercial network. It minted its own gold currency at a time when only a handful of states on Earth had the sophistication to do so. It built monumental stone architecture on a scale that still puzzles engineers today, and buried its kings beneath elaborate underground tomb complexes whose treasures may have been quietly recycled back into the empire's own economy during later, leaner centuries. It fielded armies and naval forces capable of projecting power across 2 continents, converted to Christianity nearly as early as Rome itself, and gave rise to a religious and linguistic tradition, Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity and the Ge'ez script, that has survived, essentially unbroken, for over 1,600 years, all the way into the present day. And a contemporary 3rd century observer, surveying the entire known world with genuine geopolitical sophistication, looked at all of this and concluded that Aksum belonged in exactly the same conversation as Rome, Persia, and China. That's not revisionist history. That's not modern wishful thinking trying to give an underrated civilization its flowers. That's the actual, contemporary judgment of someone who lived through that exact era and had every reason to know what he was talking about. The only genuinely strange part of this whole story is that it took the rest of the world so long to remember it. So that's the story of Aksum's rise, a kingdom that quietly became one of the 4 greatest powers on Earth, built some of the most mysterious monuments in ancient history, and then, over the course of a few centuries, faded out of the center of the world stage, while its cultural and religious legacy kept right on going, largely unnoticed, for another millennium and a half. But here's the thing. Fading from the center of the world stage isn't the same as disappearing, and what happened to Aksum's successor kingdoms next might honestly be even stranger than anything we've covered today. Because in the centuries following Aksum's decline, medieval Europe became gripped by rumors of a lost Christian kingdom, ruled by a mythical priest-king named Prester John, hidden somewhere beyond the reach of the Islamic world. A legend so persistent it drove real, serious European royal expeditions to go searching for it. And when explorers eventually did make contact with the real kingdom behind that myth, what they found, And what happened next set off a chain of events involving religious diplomacy, military alliances, and eventually, centuries later, one of the most contested cultural repatriation battles of the modern era, the fight to bring a stolen 1,700-year-old Axumite obelisk home from Rome. That's exactly the story the next video is going to tell. We're going to trace Aksum's direct successor kingdoms through the medieval period, unpack the real history behind the Prester John legend, and follow the full, wild saga of that stolen obelisk. From the moment Italian fascist forces tore it down in 1937, through nearly 7 decades on display in Rome, to its eventual, painstaking return and re-erection back home in Aksum in 2008. If you want to know how one of history's 4 greatest empires went from ruling the Red Sea to becoming a half-mythical rumor in European royal courts, and then had to fight to get its own monuments back in the 21st century, that's exactly where the story picks up next. Subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss it, and I'll see you there.